Hello, my name is Beatriz and I am 32 years old. I live in San Luis Potosí, a beautiful colonial city in central Mexico. I work at my sister Mariana's construction company and I never imagined that my life could take such a dark and chilling turn. Before everything happened, I led a quiet and routine life. I would wake up early, have my strong pot coffee and go to the office, where I spent the day handling paperwork, organizing deliveries and doing the company's accounts. I was known as Mariana's right-hand woman. Always ready to solve any trouble that came up, but oh, if I had known what was coming, maybe I would have run far away from here. My sister's company wasn't an empire, but it was growing by leaps and bounds. It started small, just the two of us in a cramped little space distributing a few construction products to the local bricklayers. Over time, it began to take shape. Demand increased, we hired more people, and in the blink of an eye, we already had a warehouse and some nice offices. I loved seeing that place full of life during the day with the comings and goings of customers and employees, but at night? Well, at night it was a different story. To be frank, I was always a bit of a BC-holic. I couldn't let go of the work until everything was at 100. That's why it was common for me to stay late at the office, long after everyone else had left. During those hours, the warehouse would be in total darkness, silent as a graveyard. Sometimes I heard some rumblings or creaks, but I always thought they were just things from my head. After all, old buildings are like that, aren't they? At least that's what I thought back then. It was on one of those extra bed nights that everything started to fall apart. I was there, focused on the numbers, when I heard a strange noise coming from the warehouse. I thought it was Rafael. Our newest employee was a strong young man, always willing to lend a hand when needed, but what I saw when I went to check. Oh dear God, it still gives me chills just thinking about it. Rafael was there in the darkness eating it, and that, just like that. Hey, eating that, I was left paralyzed not knowing what to do. I called him by his name softly, but he didn't respond. He just kept putting that white powder in his mouth as if it were the most normal thing in the world. When he finally noticed my presence, he looked at me with empty, lifeless eyes. It was then that Ted started to vomit a thick, white slime oozing. I ran to get help, but when we returned, Rafael was lying on the floor, trembling like a leaf. After that night, things were never the same again. Rafael changed forever. He used to be a cheerful guy, always telling jokes and making everyone laugh. Now he was downcast, nervous, avoiding eye contact with people. I tried to strike up conversations to see if everything was okay, but he always managed to dodge them. The other employees started to comment, saying he was acting strange, that he wasn't sleeping well. Even his little boy, a 5-year-old, was avoiding him. The situation kept getting worse and worse. One day, I couldn't take it anymore and went to his house in Colonia Satellite. Rafael's wife told me. She received me with a face full of displeasure. It was clear she was at her limit, tired and worried. She took me to the room where Rafael was sleeping, but it was not a peaceful sleep at all. He was writhing in bed with his face contorted in an expression of pure terror. His wife told me through sobs that Rafael was no longer the same, that he had horrible nightmares, that he screamed at night, that sometimes he would stare into space, murmuring nonsensical things. I left there with a heavy heart, not knowing what to do. I felt guilty, as if, in some way, all of that was my responsibility. Little did I know that this was just the beginning, that things were going to get much, much worse, and that I would find myself in the middle of a hair-raising story, full of mysteries and horrors I could never have imagined. But that is another part of the story. Things in the warehouse started to get weirder and weirder. It wasn't just Rafael who was acting bizarrely, the whole atmosphere seemed to have changed. The shadows looked denser, the air more. I was trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the stress was making me paranoid, but there was no denying that something was wrong, very wrong. One night I was working overtime again. It had become a habit, until I heard a noise that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the normal creaking of the building or the wind hitting the windows. It was a human sound, as if someone were whispering very softly, but I knew I was alone there, or at least I thought I was. With my heart in my mouth, I went to investigate. I turned on all the lights in the warehouse, checked every corner. Nothing, not a soul, but the sound kept coming from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. The next day I arrived early, and I went to talk to Joaquin. Our night watchman is an elderly gentleman, one of those who don't flinch at anything, but when I asked him if he had heard anything strange during the night, I saw the fear in his eyes. Dona Beatriz, he said, there are things in this warehouse that are better left unknown. I insisted, and she ended up telling me. He talked about inexplicable noises, of objects moving on their own, of an evil presence he felt every time he made his rounds. I wanted not to believe him, I wanted to think it was just the imagination of an old superstitious man, but after what happened with Raphael, I could no longer afford to be skeptical. I started paying more attention, observing every detail of the warehouse. It was during one of those observations that I saw it, I swear to God I saw it, a shadow moving on its own, sliding along the wall as if it had a life of its own. It wasn't anyone's shadow, there was no one there to cast it. As if the darkness had taken shape and consciousness. That night I couldn't close my eyes, I spent it tossing and turning in bed, sweating cold, reliving that scene in my head. The next day as soon as the sun came up, I was already on my feet. I couldn't stay still any longer, I had to do something. It was then that I remembered Dona Consuelo, a famous healer here in San Luis Potosí. Many people mocked. They said it was a thing for ignorant people to believe in those things, but I was too desperate to worry about what others would. To think that I found Dona Consuelo in a humble little house on the outskirts of the city. The smell of herbs and incense was so strong that it almost made me dizzy. The lady, already elderly, looked at me with eyes that seemed to see my soul. Without me saying anything, she started to speak. She said there was a very negative energy around me, that someone had done witchcraft on me, but the worst part was that, according to her, the spell had hit the wrong person. Instead of affecting me, it had affected Raphael. I left there with my head spinning. Witchcraft. The spell was too crazy to process, but a part of me knew it was true. It explained everything that was happening, all the strange things in the warehouse, Raphael's sudden change. I felt guilty, responsible for what had happened to him. If the spell was meant for me, why did he have to suffer? And more importantly, who had done this? Who hated me so much that they resorted to black magic? I returned to work that day with more questions than answers. The warehouse, which used to be just a place of work, now looked like a battlefield. Spiritual, every dark corner, every strange sound, everything seemed like a threat, and the worst part was that I didn't know how to fight against this. How do you protect yourself from something you can't even see or understand? I only knew one thing. Things were going to get worse before they got better, and I had to be prepared for whatever came next. In the days that followed, Raphael's condition went from bad to worse. He was no longer that strong and cheerful boy we knew. He was thin, pale, with dark circles under his eyes so deep they looked like black holes in his face the few times he showed up. At work, he would stay in a corner mumbling nonsensical things. I tried to approach him several times, but it was as if there were an invisible barrier separating us. His eyes, once so full of life, now seemed like two empty puddles reflecting a terror I couldn't comprehend. One afternoon, Raphael's wife called me crying rivers. She could barely speak because she was sobbing so much. Between sobs, she told me that he had had a terrible crisis, that he had screamed all night talking about shadows that were chasing him, about voices that wouldn't let him be. The worst part of it all is that he refused to be near his son. She said the boy was no longer the same, that he had something evil inside him. I was frozen in shock upon hearing that. Whatever was affecting Raphael was destroying not just him but his entire family. I couldn't stand doing nothing. Without doing anything, I grabbed the car and went straight to his house. When I arrived, the scene was heartbreaking. Raphael was huddled in a corner of the living room, trembling and sweating cold. His son, a 5-year-old little boy, was crying in the arms of his mother without understanding why his father didn't want to approach him. Raphael's wife looked at me with a mix of desperation and anger in her eyes. I knew that somehow she blamed me for what was happening. I tried to talk to Raphael, but it was useless. He just babbled nonsensical things, spoke of shadows and demons, of an evil presence that followed him everywhere. In a moment of lucidity, he grabbed my arm tightly and said, "Beatrice, it's not you, it's something much worse, something that came through you." But no. Those were the words. They froze my soul. What the hell did he mean by that? What had come through me? I left his house feeling like the most useless person in the world. I wanted to help, I wanted to do something, anything to get Raphael out of that state, but how do you fight against something you can't see, something you can't touch? Something that seemed to come straight from the depths of hell. That night I couldn't sleep. I spent the night tossing and turning in bed, thinking about everything that had happened, about how my life had turned upside down and such. Shortly after, the next morning, I received the news I feared the most. Raphael had been hospitalized. His body could no longer withstand the stress, the lack of sleep, the refusal to eat. The doctors talked about nervous exhaustion, a possible psychotic break, but I knew it was much more than that. It was something that science couldn't explain, something beyond human comprehension. And the worst part is that deep down in my heart, I knew it was my fault. I spent the following days in a state of constant anguish. I was going to. Working kept me busy with things in the warehouse, but it was as if I were on autopilot. My mind was always far away thinking about Rafael, his family, everything that was happening. The warehouse, which used to be a place full of movement and life,